Former ambassador to Argentina, Tony Leon, was the leader of the opposition party in Parliament when Nelson Mandela was president. He is with us in our Durban studios to talk about the life and times of the late Nelson Mandela. Tony Leon, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I want you to just take us back to your days as a student leader when you were out in the streets canvassing signatures for a petition to get Nelson Mandela out of prison.
Yeah, well, I was at university then. This was back in the early, I think, 1981, and we had this $1 million signature, or at least million signature campaign, should I say, to release Mandela, and all of us at Wits University were very excited. It seemed very cutting edge at the time and quite daring. Of course, it didn't lead to that result except 9 years later, but at least seemed to be some form of activity to identify with someone, of course, none of us had seen, whose photograph and image were unknown if you were in your early 20s, as I was in the 1980s, and but you even then knew that without Mandela and everything he represented, freed from jail and at a negotiating table, there were dim prospects for a peaceful future or a democracy being established in South Africa. And that, of course, a decade later is exactly what happened.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that moment you first caught a glimpse of this almost mythical individual who'd been spoken about but never seen for so long. You were standing in the crowd there on Grand Parade listening to him deliver that first speech since being freed. What was that like?
Well, I have to tell you and correct that. I was at the Grand Parade at 3 o'clock on the Sunday afternoon. I'd just been elected to Parliament. And a few days before, when Mr. de Klerk made his speech, was my first day in Parliament, and I went with my brother. I said, this is a moment in history. But, you know, after about 3.5 hours and a lot of kind of pushing and shoving and a bit of rioting, I thought, well, I'm not sure this is ever going to happen. So actually, when Mandela finally emerged, I think it was 7:30, we were actually watching it on TV from home. But that first speech was not the speech of a reconciler. It was pretty much the party line, as it was at the time. And I think a lot of people were quite disappointed that the first public appearance of this extraordinary, almost mythical figure should have been such a hardline speech. Of course, that changed almost the next day when Mandela had an encounter with the media at Archbishop Tutu's house in Bishop's Court, and more of the other Mandela, if you like, came to the fore.
And yet you went head-to-head with him in Parliament.
Yeah, well, you know, long before that, actually, before he was elected president, about 2 years before, I was a member of Parliament for Houghton, which, of course, is where he lived from the moment almost he was freed right through to his death last night. And I thought, well, I must bring the most famous new resident a chocolate cake, which I did. And to my amazement, a day or two after that, he phoned me up and said he was very pleased to have such an energetic representative in Parliament, as he described me. And he said, wouldn't you and one or two of the other DP chaps like to come for dinner? Well, you know, one doesn't refuse an invitation from Madiba. And we went along, the party leaders, Zach de Beer and I, and Ken Andrew. And that, I guess, was the beginning of the relationship. And we had quite a few meetings and encounters before he became president, because, of course, all of us on various sides of the table were involved in the constitutional negotiations at Kempton Park. And although he was not often there, he was there at the decisive moments, and he had the power of decision-making ultimately within his own movement. So we had quite a lot of getting to know each other sessions before the parliamentary elections, and then shortly afterwards, of course, he became president, and then much lower down the political food chain, I was elected leader of the Democratic Party. So we did obviously encounter each other both formally across the aisles of Parliament and in the heat and light of debate, which he quite enjoyed, I must say, and was very taken and made a great point of always giving Parliament its due and a lot of dignity. I was just listening earlier today to our Speaker of Parliament at the time, Freni Ginwalo, made the point that despite Madiba being world famous for those shirts, you know, those Indonesian-style shirts that he made his own, he always wore a suit to Parliament, and he made the point, you know, this is an institution whose dignity must be upheld, and he certainly did that, not just by wearing a suit. So, of course, there were debates and disagreements, but he said to me at a meeting that he asked me to come to, just a breakfast, one-on-one, literally a week after he was inaugurated as president in Cape Town, where Parliament was meeting, He said, you know, Tony, you must hold up a mirror as the opposition to this government. And we might not always like the reflection in the mirror, but we must see what it is. Now, he didn't always like the reflection. Sometimes he got very agitated if you pushed points that he disagreed with or which perhaps impacted directly on some party interest. But by and large, more than perhaps anyone else at that time or since, he not only led a country and led a party and led a nation, but he also encouraged very robust parliamentary dialogue and political debate.
You've just recently written about Madiba's biggest gift. And what is that?
His biggest gift?
That's right.
Yeah, I think there were several. If I might say, the first was he did at critical moments manage to separate the interests of the party from the interests of the country. And of course, they're not always the same. And I can think of three particular moments, which is seizing of a very, very difficult occasion and turning it around probably would not have happened to anyone else. I think the most significant was the murder of Chris Hani on the Easter weekend in 1993, when the negotiations were still in process and a lot of issues hadn't been agreed. And of course, that was the ultimate racial moment in South Africa's history in the making, because you had two white assassins of a very revered black leader. And what Mandela did was to go onto national television and say, not just about the mourning the loss of Chris Hani, which is obviously a huge hammer blow for the ANC and the SA Communist Party, but to point out, which probably no one else had taken note of at the time, that it was an Afrikaans woman in Boksburg who had identified or given the identity of the vehicle with the assassins in it. And he made that point in a very explicit manner, and I think helped defang a lot of the poison that was in the atmosphere at a very perilous moment in South Africa. So that would be the one moment that was perhaps above all others helped move us forward. The second was when the Truth and Reconciliation report was published in October 1998, and it was quite instructive because the former president, who was the leader, had been the leader of the National Party, F.W. de Klerk, went to court to try and interdict it and get some of its contents removed. And the president in waiting, Thabo Mbeki, was outraged that the TRC had made adverse findings against the ANC and their human rights predations in exile, and he felt they shouldn't be judged on the same standard as the National Party government. And Archbishop Tutu obviously very excised about this. And Mandela took the attitude not as the leader or president of the ANC, but as president of South Africa, and said basically publish and be damned. And that report is in the domain and in the interests of all South Africans. So I think that was the second really extraordinary moment, and there were obviously ancillary ones like accepting judgments of the High Court, the Appeal Court, and the Constitutional Court, in the case of the Constitution itself, which went against either his interests or the party interests or even some governmental interest, and he never took much more than an hour to decide that he would abide judgments of the court that went against him. And I actually think his act of leaving, much revered and hallowed by us all, after a single term in office, and saying this is not a, and we have many examples to the north of us, of course, of presidents for life and dictators, and I think Mandela sent an enormously powerful signal that he did not want to cling to office. And I know many people said, well, what a pity he didn't serve a second term. But I actually think that example, the power of his example, put South Africa very firmly on the road to being a constitutional democracy.
Tony Leon, I just want to end perhaps on a slightly lighter note, and this stems from all the comments we've had today about Nelson Mandela's great sense of humour. And I understand as part of that sparring between the both of you that sometimes went on, that Madiba had occasion one day to refer to the DP as a Mickey Mouse party. I understand there was an event that led off from that sparring between the both of you.
Yeah, it was very, we were having these sort of parliamentary jousts. It was actually at the end of 1998, and Mandela lost his temper and said, oh, the Democratic Party and the National Party are just Mickey Mouse parties. And I was doing a series of campaign rallies around the country, and some journalist said, well, what do you think of the president's attack on you as a Mickey Mouse party? So I said, well, if we're a Mickey Mouse party, then he's in charge of a goofy government. I mean, very Disney-esque dialogue we had then. And anyway, and unfortunately, a few days later, I had to go for some very serious open heart surgery at the Mill Park Hospital in Johannesburg, beginning of December 1998. And I was waiting with some trepidation with my fiancée, later wife, in the ward, in my private ward at the Mill Park Hospital for this operation, which I wasn't looking forward to the next day. And there was this knock on the door, and the world famous voice was there, and he said, hello. He said, it's Goofy here, is Mickey Mouse in? Can I come and see you? And there was Mandela coming to see me the night before a rather big operation. Of course, I have little doubt that his presence and that emblematic smile and that warmth helped speed a very successful recovery. And I think you have in that the measure of someone who could always reach out and didn't let differences stand in the way of very good human relations. And I think so many people, it wasn't just the fact that I was the leader of the Democratic Party at the time and one of his political adversaries, but he could reach out and change so many lives. I do need to say, of course, I think it was easier for Mandela and me to have a straightforward relationship because the Democratic Party hadn't yet become the Democratic Alliance. We weren't the largest opposition. I think his political relationships with rivals who were closer to him because they served in government or were bigger forces at the time, like de Klerk's National Party and Buthelezzi's eNCA Freedom Party, I think those relationships were more complex and I think they were more fraught. But, happily, I was in a different position in a different time.
Thank you for sharing those wonderful memories with us, Tony Leon, former ambassador to Argentina. Well, the world
News that moves. eNCA.com.